Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Chapter 1. A Death in the Choir. Loft Bracton under Wire was the sort of village one might imagine printed on a tea towel. Neat, sleepy, picturesque. Its cottages, with their moss-touched roofs and ivy-covered walls, nestled close as if whispering confidences. The church, St. Anselm's, stood at the heart of the village, its flint tower rising modestly above the tiled rooftops, its bell slow to ring, its congregation slower still to change. On the morning of October the 27th, the air was crisp with the bite of early autumn. The leaves, golden and rust-red, littered the narrow lanes like confetti, and the low sun cast long churchy shadows on the village green. The service was due to begin at 10:30. As the bell tolled, the villagers filed into the pews, quietly, reverently, as they always had. It was Clarissa Wire, the choir's newest soprano, who first noted the odd delay. The organ had begun its gentle prelude, but the vicar, Reverend Edwin Lott, had not taken his customary place at the pulpit. The hymn books lay open. The choir, arranged in their stalls, shifted uneasily. Murmurs began to flutter like moths through the nave. "Where is Reverend Lott?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby, who occupied the same pew every Sunday, 3 from the front, aisle seat. The choirmaster, Mr. Lionel Dray, flushed and gestured for silence, though his own brow was pinched. After several long minutes, he rose awkwardly and muttered something about a minor delay. He then disappeared up the narrow stair that led to the choir loft, a small platform high above the nave, from which the organ was played and the hymns conducted. When Dray returned, his face had drained of all colour. He clutched the banister as if the stairs had sapped him of strength. In a voice strained and oddly formal, he addressed the congregation. "Please remain calm. There's been an incident. I must ask you to return to your homes." Gasps rippled through the pews. Someone asked if there had been an accident. Dray gave no reply. That afternoon, the doors of St. Anselm's were closed, and the local constable, P.C. Minton, stood at the lich gate, allowing no one to enter. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Bracton, with the exaggerated momentum of rumour. Heart failure, stroke, foul play. Inside the church, the vicar lay slumped over the organ bench. One arm hung limply at his side. His other hand still rested lightly on the keys, as if in mid-chord. His face was calm, peaceful even, save for a slight curl of the lip and a tiny trace of foam. P.C. Minton, who had never investigated anything more serious than a stolen bicycle, wrinkled his nose. "Almonds," he murmured. The parish doctor, summoned quickly and entirely out of his depth, concurred. There was something off about the scene. Heart failure was possible, but not certain. The foaming and the scent suggested something more sinister. It was Captain Arthur Hastings, retired military man and guest of a local landowner, who suggested an outside expert. Hastings had seen murder up close, too close, and though his own powers of deduction were modest, he knew brilliance when he saw it. "I say," he told the constable, over a lukewarm pint at the Crown and Clarion that evening, "I've a friend, a man with the most extraordinary little grey cells. You won't have heard of anyone like him, I promise you that." P.C. Minton, who did not like the idea of being out of his depth, nevertheless agreed. A telegram was sent to London. It read, simply, "Urgent, unexplained, death in Bracton Church. Please come. Your old friend Hastings." And so the next day, a black motor car arrived, purring into the village with elegant precision. From it emerged a small, dapper figure dressed immaculately in grey, woolen suit pressed to perfection, leather gloves soft as butter, shoes that gleamed like mirrors, and, most distinctive of all, an imperial moustache, thick, curled, and masterfully waxed. Monsieur Hercule Poirot had come to Bracton under wire. The villagers naturally stared. Poirot paid them little mind. He tipped his hat, carried a smart valise, and was shown directly to the vicarage, where he greeted Hastings with a warm but measured handshake. "My dear Hastings," he said in his charmingly accented English, "why is it that murder so often follows where you go?" Hastings chuckled awkwardly. "Pure coincidence, I assure you." "Mais non, mon ami, I do not believe in coincidence." Poirot was shown the scene that very afternoon. He stood in the choir loft for some time, gazing at the organ, the bench, the beams above. His eyes missed nothing. He moved slowly, methodically, fingers clasped behind his back. "There is a smell," he said at last. "Almonds, yes?" "The scent of cyanide. That, Hastings, is not natural in a church." He knelt by the bench and examined the vicar's effects. A slim notebook lay closed nearby, a hymn book marked with a red ribbon, and, curiously, a clean glass goblet tucked discreetly beneath the bench itself. "A communion glass," Poirot said softly. "Yet why here, so far from the altar?" He took a handkerchief and examined the organ keys. A residue, powdery, faint. Something was placed here, perhaps something mixed into a drink. It was taken willingly, no struggle, no sign of violence. He turned to Hastings. "This is not an accident, and it is not suicide. This, I think, is a murder concealed beneath devotion." Outside, the sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows. The saints stared down impassively. The vicar lay still in the mortuary. And in the choir loft, Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Bring me the people of the church, Hastings," he said quietly. "We must speak to the flock." Chapter 2. The Gathering of the Flock. The drawing room of the vicarage was a place of calm order, lined with bookshelves of sermons and scripture, and framed by stiff lace curtains that filtered the grey afternoon light. Yet on this particular day, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, sat primly on a floral armchair, a delicate cup of tea balanced in one hand, and a plate of shortbread in the other. Hastings stood beside the hearth, politely declining the biscuits, but taking everything in with quiet curiosity. The constable, P.C. Minton, had assembled the key figures of the parish for informal questioning. They now sat in a loose circle before Poirot, each wearing an expression ranging from grief to guardedness. Poirot surveyed them with his usual intensity, his eyes lingering not on what they said, but how they said it, and, just as importantly, what they chose not to say. First to speak was Mrs. Blanche Lott, the vicar's widow. She was a woman of striking poise, not quite beautiful but handsome, in that patrician way often mistaken for detachment. She wore a dark maroon dress, not black, notably, and her hands, gloved even indoors, rested neatly in her lap. "My husband was not a man to make enemies, Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice crisp and emotionless. "He was respected here. Quiet, perhaps overly so, but never unkind." Poirot raised a neat eyebrow. "Yet I am told he received anonymous letters of late." Mrs. Lott's lips tightened. "Yes. Bible verses mostly. Threats, though couched in scripture. We never made much of them." "Did he suspect anyone?" She shook her head slowly. "He wouldn't say. Edwin was proud. He considered it beneath him to be rattled by such things." Poirot offered her a gentle smile. "Merci, madame. Your composure is admirable." She said nothing, but the briefest shadow flickered across her face. Next was Mr. Lionel Dray, the choirmaster. A wiry man in his late 40s with thinning hair and darting eyes, Dray had the air of someone used to control and unused to scrutiny. His fingers tapped restlessly on the armrest of his chair. "I don't see how I can help you," he said, almost belligerently. "It's the doctor's business to determine cause of death, isn't it?" "Not mine." Poirot nodded, unoffended. "Perhaps, but your perspective is valuable. You were the last to see the Reverend alive." Dray hesitated. He wasn't himself lately. Distracted, short-tempered. He'd made odd choices with the church finances, cancelled the new organ refurbishment. We'd already ordered the plans. "Did this cause ill feeling between you?" Dray sniffed. "We argued, yes, but I didn't kill the man over a set of pipes, if that's what you're implying." "I imply nothing, Monsieur Dray. I merely listen." Third came Miss Agnes Peake, the vicar's long-time secretary. She was pale, small-boned, and seemed to shrink further into her cardigan as Poirot addressed her. Her voice trembled, but her eyes, watery though they were, held a glimmer of sharpness. "Reverend Lot was a good man," she said quietly. "But lately," he seemed afraid. Not of anything physical, more spiritual. He'd sit in the loft after services, not reading, not playing, just thinking. Poirot leaned forward. "And did he confide in you, mademoiselle?" She hesitated. "Only once. He said he feared temptation had entered the church. I didn't understand what he meant, but he seemed burdened." Hastings exchanged a look with Poirot. "Temptation," he murmured. "Indeed," Poirot said softly, a word rich with meaning. Then came Colonel Francis Penbury, retired, moustached, and irascible. He wore his military medals even in civilian clothes and treated every conversation like an interrogation. "Lot was weak," he barked, "soft on doctrine, too much about forgiveness, not enough fire and brimstone. I told him so straight to his face." "You disagreed with his theology?" Poirot asked mildly. "I disagreed with his politics masquerading as theology," the colonel growled. "All this modern talk of inclusion and understanding, not what the Bible teaches, not at all." "You believe that made him a target?" The colonel's eyes gleamed. "It made him controversial, certainly. Some of the old families stopped attending. There was a row last Easter over his sermon on grace. That sort of thing festers, you know." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed it does." Lastly, Clarissa Wire. She sat apart from the others, hands folded in her lap. Young, perhaps 22, with honey blonde hair, and a fragile prettiness that drew attention she did not seem to want. She had been the one to first notice the vicar's absence. Poirot regarded her gently. "Mademoiselle Wire, you sang in the choir, did you not?" She nodded. "Yes, I joined only this summer." "Did the Reverend show particular attention to you?" Her face flushed. "He was kind, encouraging, that's all." "Others noticed his kindness, perhaps?" She swallowed. "Mr. Dray did. I think it annoyed him. And Mrs. Lot. Well, she never said anything, but I always felt her watching." Poirot observed her closely. Her discomfort was real, he thought, but whether from grief or guilt, he could not yet say. When the interviews concluded, Poirot rose. He walked slowly about the room, examining the mantel clock, the worn rug, the bookshelf near the window. His gaze lingered on a slim volume in the corner, half tucked behind a pewter vase. He plucked it free. "Sacred Verses and Sinister Minds," he read aloud. "A study of crimes among clergy. How curious." Mrs. Lot glanced at the book. "A recent gift. Tasteless, I thought." "Perhaps," Poirot said, returning it to the shelf, "but sometimes taste reveals more than we suspect." As the others departed, Poirot remained seated, folding his hands. "Hastings, what do you make of them?" "They all seem to have motives of some sort," Hastings said, frowning, "but nothing concrete. It's all just tension and innuendo." "Ah, but innuendo is often the shadow cast by truth," Poirot replied. "Consider, mon ami, a respected vicar receives threats, sits brooding in a hidden place, and dies where few even know he goes. Someone knew his habits, someone close." He paused, tapping a finger to his lips. "I begin to see the shape of the thing, but not yet the edges. Let us tomorrow examine the loft once more. There are details yet to speak." Outside, the church bell tolled faintly in the wind, as though mourning its own silence. Within, Hercule Poirot prepared to unearth the secrets Bracton under wire had long kept buried. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Loft. The next morning, Bracton under wire was blanketed in mist. The narrow lanes and sloping rooftops seemed to hold their breath beneath the low, white sky. The villagers moved quietly, eyes averted, as though the very ground now held whispers of sin. The church remained closed, its wooden doors barred, a ribbon of police tape fluttering faintly at the edge. Hercule Poirot, undeterred by fog or local superstition, returned to St. Anselm's with Hastings and P.C. Minton just after 9. He was dressed in a neat charcoal suit, a dove-grey scarf tucked neatly beneath his collar, and his gloves immaculate despite the damp air. "Punctuality, Hastings," he declared as they approached the stone steps. "It is the courtesy of kings and detectives." Inside, the nave lay in deep silence, its shadows elongated by pale morning light. The stained glass, usually so vibrant, had dulled to grey. Poirot ascended to the choir loft, his polished shoes tapping softly on the ancient wood. Hastings followed, less graceful, brushing cobwebs from his sleeve. The space was small, no more than 12 feet across, but neatly arranged. A narrow bench, a high-backed chair, a music stand, and the large pipe organ filled most of it. The air here smelled faintly of polish, parchment, and something else, just the whisper of almonds now fading. Poirot paused beside the organ. He examined the bench again, more slowly this time, running a gloved hand along the side. "Tell me, Hastings," he said without looking up, "do you recall what the doctor said about the vicar's cause of death?" Hastings frowned. They suspected cyanide based on the smell and the frothing, but no definite toxicology yet. "Oui? Cyanide leaves few signs, but it is rarely ingested accidentally. One does not go about sipping poison unless one is led to do so." He turned his attention to the goblet found beneath the bench. It had already been bagged by the constable and labelled for testing, but Poirot asked Minton to fetch it again. He inspected it delicately. "There is no residue on the rim," he mused. "No lipstick, of course, and no dregs, washed clean or perhaps never used." "So the poison wasn't in the goblet?" Hastings asked. "Perhaps not. Or perhaps the Reverend used it himself and rinsed it after. The question remains, who gave him something to drink before he came here?" Poirot moved to the music stand. A hymn book lay open, though the ribbon marker was oddly positioned, tucked not into the expected page, but slipped between the back cover and flyleaf. Poirot opened it with care. "Aha!" he breathed. "See, Hastings, look here!" Inside the back cover, someone had scribbled a note in pencil. Psalm 55, 15, "Let death seize upon them and let them go down quick into hell." Poirot raised his eyebrows. A rather dramatic verse, n'est-ce pas? Hastings read it with unease. Another anonymous message? Perhaps, but it is not torn from a letter or placed as a warning. This is private, hidden even. A message the vicar found, or perhaps left, for himself. Poirot replaced the book and turned to the floorboards. He dropped to one knee and pressed against a slightly raised edge near the rear corner of the loft. It gave way. "A loose plank," he murmured. "Always, always, Hastings. Churches and secrets, they go hand in hand." Within the hollow beneath was a slim black folder, nearly invisible against the dust. Poirot opened it delicately. Inside were 5 handwritten pages neatly numbered and signed E. Lot. The ink was slightly smudged but legible. He began to read aloud. "Confession is not only for the penitent, it is also for the keeper of secrets. I have come to suspect that one among us wears piety as disguise. There have been things misplaced, items removed from the vestry safe. I have not dared confront them without proof." Poirot stopped. "Mon Dieu," he said softly. "So? The Reverend suspected theft?" Hastings was already looking over his shoulder. "Items removed from the safe? What sort of items?" Poirot flipped ahead to the 3rd page. "And yet the more I consider the circumstances, the more I believe it is not greed, but something darker. A need to punish. I have found books in the sacristy that should not be there, books on exorcism, occult history, scripture reinterpreted for vengeance. Someone has turned belief into weaponry." Poirot closed the folder gently. "So, we see now the Reverend was not merely anxious," he said. "He was conducting an inquiry of his own, and he feared what he found. Back in the nave, they examined the vestry, Reverend Lot's private study and store for sacred objects. A small wall safe was set into the stone. With the constable's reluctant assistance, it was opened. Inside were communion vessels, sealed envelopes, and a small cloth pouch. Poirot opened the pouch carefully. Inside, a fine powder, crystalline, with a pale yellow hue. Poirot held it to the light. "It is not flour," he said wryly. "Let us suppose it is cyanide." Hastings looked stunned. "He stored it himself? But why?" Poirot considered. "Or perhaps he took it from another, removed it for safekeeping. Remember his words, items removed. He may have found it and hidden it, not knowing how deeply the matter ran." They replaced the pouch and closed the safe. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. The village green shimmered in silver light. Poirot stood at the church door for a moment, staring down the path as though seeing something far beyond its reach. Then he turned to Hastings. "There is one more thing I require before we proceed," he said. "I must speak to the choir again. Not all of them. Only one." "Clarissa Wire?" "Oui, the girl who sings so sweetly, and who knows far more than she has yet dared say." Chapter 4. A note in the choir. Clarissa Wire lived in a modest cottage at the edge of Bracton-under-Wire, the sort that looked charming in spring postcards but bleak under a November sky. Poirot arrived just past midday, umbrella in one hand and Hastings at his side. He was shown in by Clarissa herself, pale-faced, polite, and clearly nervous. "Please," she said, ushering them into the sitting room. "Do sit down. I wasn't expecting company." Poirot gave her a gentle nod. "Mademoiselle, we are most grateful for your time. I merely wish to ask a few questions about the Reverend and your role in the choir." She sat, perching on the edge of an old armchair. The room smelled faintly of rose talc and damp stone. Hastings noted a piano in the corner, its lid dusty, the keys slightly yellowed. Poirot began in a soft tone. "You said you joined the choir only this summer. What brought you to Bracton-under-Wire, if I may ask?" Clarissa hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "My mother passed in May. I inherited this house from an aunt I barely knew. I'd grown up in London. I suppose I needed quiet." "Space. A place to escape?" Poirot asked, not unkindly. Her eyes flicked to his. "Perhaps." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you formed a bond with the Reverend Lot?" Clarissa paused. He was kind, more than kind. He gave me music, purpose. He never pried. And yet, you noticed tension within the parish? She looked down. I noticed people whispering. About me, I think. Mrs. Lott always seemed to be watching. Mr. Dray, too. He made me uncomfortable, not overtly, but always lingering. Hastings frowned. Was the vicar aware of this? Clarissa hesitated. I think so. A few weeks ago he asked me to stay behind after choir practice. He looked troubled. He told me not to trust everyone. That some sins wear a smile. Poirot's eyes lit faintly. And did he mention any names? She shook her head. Number? He asked me if I'd noticed anything missing from the sacristy. I hadn't, but he seemed convinced something was wrong. Poirot tapped his fingers together. Did he ever give you something to hold? Or ask you to hide anything? Clarissa looked startled. Number nothing like that. Poirot rose and walked slowly about the room. He paused at the piano, opening its lid with a faint creak. A few sheets of music rested on the stand. He examined one. Ave Verum Corpus, he read aloud. A piece of great sorrow and beauty. You sang it last Sunday, did you not? She nodded. It was the vicar's request. Poirot examined the sheet more closely. In the upper corner, in faint pencil, were the initials EL and a small circle around a particular bar. 3 low minor notes. He turned. Did the vicar give you this? Clarissa stood. Yes, just days before he died. He said it was his favourite arrangement. Poirot raised the sheet. Would you permit me to borrow this? She nodded. Of course. I don't know if it means anything. Oh, mademoiselle, he said with a faint smile. Everything means something. As they left the cottage, Hastings glanced back at the curtained window. Do you believe her? Poirot's moustache twitched. She is sincere, Hastings, but sincerity can hide many things, especially from oneself. They walked a few paces in silence. Then Poirot added, Did you see how she avoided the question about whether the vicar gave her something? She said, Nothing like that. It is not the same as saying nothing. Back in the village square, the air had turned damp again. The bell tower loomed against the grey sky. Poirot returned to the vicarage, where he had requested another meeting with Agnes Peake, the vicar's secretary. She greeted them with a faint smile and a tray of weak tea. Monsieur Poirot, she said, setting down the tray, have you made progress? I make steps, Miss Peake, Poirot said, but I must ask you, did the Reverend Lott ever speak of Miss Wire in any concerned terms? Agnes frowned. No, not in so many words, but he asked me to keep an eye on her. He said she was gifted, but too trusting. He worried about her. And did he ever mention any items missing from the church? Agnes nodded. Yes. About a month ago he said the vestry ledger had been tampered with. He thought money might have been moved. Nothing large, just small entries changed. I looked, but I couldn't find the discrepancies. Poirot folded his arms. And would you say anyone else besides you and the Reverend had access to the vestry? Only Mr. Dray. Occasionally Colonel Penbury when dealing with the church funds. Oh, and Mrs. Lott, of course, had keys to every room. Très bien. One last thing. Did the Reverend Lott ever write anything, apart from sermons? Agnes blinked. Not that I know of, though I did once see him take a small leather journal from his coat. He didn't carry it often. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A journal? Yes, but I haven't seen it since. It wasn't among his things after... Poirot turned to Hastings. A private journal, gone missing after his death. That may speak louder than any sermon. As they stepped out again, the fog now lifting for good, Hastings asked, You think the journal contains the key? I think, said Poirot, that the journal is the one voice we have not yet heard, and if someone took it, it was not to preserve his memory, but to bury it. They were halfway down the lane when a shout called out behind them. Mr. Poirot. It was P.C. Minton running up with a telegram. Poirot took it, opened it, and read silently. "Well, Hastings," he said, handing it over. "The results are in. The goblet contains no poison, but the vicar's stomach did. Cyanide confirmed." "Then the poison came from elsewhere," Hastings said. "Wait," Poirot replied. "But more interesting is this. There were trace amounts of belladonna as well, a sedative, used first perhaps to still the nerves or to ensure he did not resist." He looked back at the church. 2 poisons, 1 death. Someone wanted him quiet, but also wanted him aware enough to understand his fate. Poirot paused and then said, almost to himself, "Now, who in a village of God-fearing souls would make murder a lesson?" Chapter 5. The Ledger of Lies. The following morning, Poirot and Hastings returned to the vicarage, the mist finally gone and the skies a pale milky blue. The air had taken on a bitter chill. Something in the village had shifted. Conversations dropped when Poirot passed, and faces turned quickly away. Inside the vicar's study, Agnes Peake had already laid out the vestry's financial records on a wide oak table. The room was stuffy, thick with the scent of old paper, lavender polish, and dust stirred from its long, settled corners. Poirot adjusted his gloves. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." Agnes nodded, lips pressed thin. She seemed older in the morning light, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. "Do you truly believe," she asked softly, "that the Reverend's death was no accident?" Poirot looked up. "I believe, Miss Peake, that someone wanted him silenced, and I believe these ledgers may begin to tell us why." He gestured for Hastings to sit beside him. Together they began to review the records, handwritten entries for offerings, tithes, choir expenses, donations for the poor box, and upkeep of the graveyard. At first, all seemed in order. Each sum was neatly entered with initials, mostly EL, some AP. But then, about 6 weeks prior, Poirot noticed something peculiar. "Regardez, I see," he murmured. A line struck through a £20 donation, and a new total added above it, but not in the vicar's hand. "This is heavier, more angular." Hastings peered at it. "You think someone altered the records?" "May we, and more than once." Flipping back and forth, Poirot marked 4 entries, all altered by the same hand. Together they reduced the apparent incoming donations by £100 over the course of a month. Hastings whistled. Someone was skimming the books? Perhaps. Or someone wanted it to seem as though money had gone missing. Poirot tapped his temple. Remember, theft may not always be about greed. It can be used to frame, to distract, or to provoke. They returned to the square, where Colonel Penbury's red brick manor overlooked the green like a sullen old general. The colonel, summoned earlier by telegram, greeted them stiffly in his drawing room, a whisky already in hand, despite the hour. "I've reviewed the ledgers," Poirot began without ceremony. "I found altered entries. Who else had access to the vestry funds?" Penbury's face clouded. "Only the Reverend and I handled the major accounts. Miss Peake had access to choir expenses, but not tithes or offerings. Reverend Lott was meticulous, made his own tallies every week." "And did he ever raise concerns?" Penbury hesitated. 2 weeks ago, yes. He told me some numbers didn't match, said he would investigate quietly. I offered to help, but he declined." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And did he name anyone he suspected?" Buddy looked tired, worn down. I told him he ought to take a short retreat. The Colonel's voice lowered. He said he couldn't, not until he'd settled what must be settled. Poirot stood. Merci, Colonel. One final question. What is your view of Mr. Dre, the choirmaster? Penbury's jaw clenched. Strange fellow, efficient but cold. I never quite liked his manner, too intense. The choirmaster, as if summoned by the sound of his name, was found an hour later in the church's music room, sorting sheets for Advent hymns. Mr. Basil Dre was tall, wiry, with steel-grey hair combed flat and wire-frame spectacles that magnified pale eyes. He looked up without greeting. I suppose you've come to ask about the Reverend? Poirot inclined his head. Among other things. Tell me, Monsieur Dre, were you close with Reverend Lot? Dre snorted. Close, but I respected his theological understanding. But we did not agree on everything. On what, for instance? The use of music, Dre said curtly. He believed in warmth, softness, mercy. I believe in discipline, reverence, awe. Poirot paced slowly. And did this difference ever lead to conflict? Only artistic tension. He was too forgiving, too trusting. Poirot paused at the organ. And how did you feel about Clarissa Wire? Dre's mouth twitched. She has a beautiful voice, but she's distracting, draws attention. Attention from whom? Dre's lips thinned. Everyone. Doted on her? It disrupted the tone of the choir. Poirot turned. Mr. Dre, do you keep your own records? A choir budget, perhaps? Dre stiffened. I submit expenses to Miss Peake. Do you keep personal notes? No. Poirot eyed him steadily. Then why did Clarissa Wire's music sheets contain markings in your handwriting? Dre said nothing. His hands twitched at his sides. I think, Poirot said slowly, you are a man who values control. And when someone threatened that control, be it Clarissa or the Reverend, you grew resentful. Dre took a sharp breath. I was not involved in the vicar's death. Poirot raised a brow. You do not ask what makes me suspect you. You simply deny involvement. I know how this looks, Dre muttered. But I respected him, even if I disagreed with him. Poirot nodded. Very well, Mr. Dre, that is all, for now. Outside, Hastings exhaled. He's hiding something. Poirot nodded. Indeed, but guilt and motive are not twins. Sometimes one follows the other from a distance. We must be patient. They returned to the church once more. Poirot walked alone to the vestry, where the light from the stained glass bled across the wooden floor like coloured water. There, on the edge of the desk, Poirot noticed a fragment of paper tucked behind a candle holder. It had likely fallen during the initial chaos. He picked it up and read, She found it. If she tells him, it all ends. It must be tonight. No signature, no date. Just hurried pencil lines on torn stationery. Poirot stared at it for a long moment. She found it, he repeated. Who is she? What did she find? And who feared the ending so terribly they resorted to murder? He turned toward the altar. I am beginning to see, Hastings, he murmured, that this was not merely the silencing of a man, it was the prevention of a revelation, a truth buried in secrets, in psalms and poisons. He tapped his temple. And now we must bring it to light. Chapter 6. The Secret. She found. The note haunted Poirot. She found it. If she tells him, it all ends. It must be tonight. Its implication was clear. Someone believed a woman had uncovered a secret, one so dangerous it warranted murder. And the Reverend Lot had died that very night. The timing was too precise, the handwriting too deliberate. It was no idle warning, it was a plan. Poirot's first task was to determine the she in question. By mid-morning, he and Hastings stood once again at Clarissa Wyer's garden gate. Frost clung to the window panes, and the trees rattled with a dry wind. Clarissa opened the door in a thick cardigan, her face pale and drawn. "I know," she said before they could speak. "You've found something, haven't you?" Poirot inclined his head. "May we come in?" She led them inside. The parlour fire was unlit, and her hands shook as she poured tea. Poirot refused the cup. "Miss Wyer," he said gently, "do you recall anything unusual from the week before the vicar's death? Any discoveries you made? Perhaps something written?" Clarissa's eyes dropped to the teacups. "I found a letter," she admitted. "I wasn't looking for it. It was in the hymnal cupboard at the back of the church. I dropped my gloves and saw it behind the shelf. I don't think he meant for anyone to see it." She rose, crossed the room, and returned with a folded sheet. Poirot took it delicately. It was addressed not to anyone, but clearly written in Lot's hand. "I have seen too much to be silent any longer. The truth lies not in the balance sheets, but in the bonds we form. If anything should happen to me, Clarissa must go to Agnes. She knows where the rest is kept." Poirot read it twice, then folded it with precision. "May I keep this?" Clarissa nodded. "I meant to bring it forward, but after his death, I panicked. I thought it would make me look guilty." Poirot gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Did the Reverend ever mention something he called the rest? Did he keep a journal?" Clarissa hesitated. "Yes, a small black one. I saw him write in it once in the vestry. He tucked it into a hollow space behind a loose brick. I thought nothing of it at the time." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Which wall?" She pointed. "The back wall, by the old prayer desk. I remember the brick had a tiny cross scratched into it." "Merci, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly. "You have helped more than you realize." As they returned to the church, Poirot moved with unusual purpose. In the vestry, he knelt by the wall Clarissa had described and ran his fingers along the bricks. After a moment, he found it, the faint cross etched into the mortar. With a faint click, the brick loosened. Behind it, a small, leather-bound notebook lay waiting. "Voilà," Poirot whispered. He opened it with care. The handwriting was precise, methodical. Pages were dated, stretching back nearly a year. Some passages were spiritual reflections, others mundane notes. But one entry, circled in ink, stood out. March 12th. "I have confirmed it. Church funds have been redirected, laundered through restoration projects that do not exist. Dre is involved, possibly Penbury. I do not yet know who holds the reins. Agnes suspects, but I have said nothing to her. I fear I've waited too long. Clarissa must protect her." Poirot snapped the book shut. "So," said Hastings slowly, "this wasn't about theology. This was about theft." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami, this was about conscience. He uncovered fraud, and someone feared exposure." They returned to the vicarage, where Agnes Peake met them in the hallway, eyes wide. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I think I know what the rest meant." "Follow me." She led them to the Reverend's study. Behind a bookshelf of battered volumes, she pulled out a narrow tin box. Inside were envelopes, donation receipts, repair invoices, and correspondence from contractors. "Look," she said, showing a page. "These are the projects listed in the vestry accounts, but this company, Stonewell Repairs, doesn't exist. I've checked twice." Poirot leafed through the letters. Forged receipts, false repairs, someone funneling money out of the church under a false name. Agnes nodded. "The vicar suspected Colonel Penbury, but he couldn't prove it." Poirot tapped the tin. "Now we can—" Agnes looked stricken. You don't think Pembury killed him? Poirot didn't answer directly. Did the Reverend ever confide anything more personal to you? She hesitated. Yes, once. He told me he'd made a mistake, that someone he trusted had betrayed him. He didn't say who, but I thought he meant Basil Dre. Poirot gave a slow nod. I suspect he meant someone else entirely. Tell me, Miss Peake, were you aware of a disagreement between Mrs. Lott and the Reverend? Agnes looked surprised. I thought they were distant, not unkind. Poirot's voice softened. He knew she was unhappy. He told Clarissa he feared she had become involved, romantically, with someone else. Agnes turned pale. Number? Surely not. Oh, but yes, and I believe that man, if he feared exposure, might have seen Clarissa's discovery as a threat. Poirot turned away. Come, Hastings, we must speak once more with Mrs. Lott. At the Lott home, Mary Lott received them in the sitting room, dressed in mourning but composed. Her hands, gloved in black, rested quietly in her lap. Poirot bowed. Madame, forgive the intrusion, but I must ask you plainly, did you love your husband? Mary blinked. I respected him. That is not what I asked. She inhaled. We hadn't shared much in years. He lived in his books. I lived elsewhere. Emotionally or physically? She flinched. Poirot continued gently. You do not have to speak it, but I believe you loved someone else, perhaps someone who offered you warmth. Mary's eyes filled. He knew, he never said it, but I think he knew. Did the man you loved know that Reverend Lott had found out? A long pause. Yes. Poirot rose. And now, madame, I ask you one final question. Did you see your husband the evening before his death? Her voice trembled. He was in the study, writing. He looked calm. He told me he would take communion alone the next morning. I thought nothing of it. Poirot nodded. And did you? She looked away. I never expected him to die, she whispered. Outside, Hastings whispered, You don't believe she did it, do you? No, Poirot replied. But I believe the man she loved would do anything to protect them both, even poison a priest. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. The bells of St. Mildred's tolled 5 times, solemn, slow and steady. A hush fell across the village green as the late afternoon sky darkened, not from dusk, but from a gathering storm. Thunder rumbled faintly across the horizon, a fitting backdrop for what Poirot had planned. Inside the church, the air was thick with anticipation. At Poirot's request, the major figures in the vicar's life had been summoned to the nave: Colonel Pembury, Basil Dre, Agnes Peake, Clarissa Wire, and Mary Lott. They sat on separate pews, none looking at each other directly. Poirot stood before the altar, his silhouette framed by the coloured glow of the stained glass window behind him. Hastings stood slightly to the side, notebook in hand. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, voice calm and even, I thank you for coming. What I am about to say concerns the death of Reverend Simon Lott, a man whose passing was, I assure you, no accident. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Basil Dre shifted uncomfortably. Clarissa clutched her handbag. Colonel Pembury frowned. Poirot raised a hand for silence. Let us first dispense with what is known. Reverend Lott died not of illness, but of poisoning. A tincture of belladonna, deadly nightshade, was present in the communion wine. This was no random tragedy. It was murder, carefully planned. Mary Lott gasped quietly, her face paling. Poirot continued, And what is more, it was committed not in haste, but with cold intent, because the vicar had discovered a secret, one involving theft, betrayal, and a past carefully concealed. He paced slowly before them. I found, tucked in the vestry wall, the Reverend's private journal. In it he recorded suspicions of falsified donations, of phantom restoration expenses, and of a man he feared but could not yet name. That man was stealing from the church. Poirot turned to Penbury. Colonel, you oversaw much of the church's financial oversight. You were also the one who encouraged Reverend Lott to take a retreat, precisely when the falsified entries appeared. What say you to that? Penbury sat straighter. Are you accusing me of murder? Poirot raised a brow. I'm accusing you of collusion. You may not have poisoned the wine, but you knew more than you claimed. You turned a blind eye, perhaps in exchange for silence about a certain affair. The Colonel flushed. That's outrageous. Poirot turned. But the true thief, the one who forged the repair receipts and created the fictional company known as Stonewell Repairs, was not you. He faced Basil Dray. Mr. Dray, he said quietly, the ink used in the false receipts matches that used in your rehearsal notes. The handwriting, disguised as it was, bears your pressure signature. You embezzled money from the church. Dray stood abruptly. Lies! Then you will not object if I turn these notes over to Scotland Yard. A silence. Dray sat back down, his jaw clenched. Poirot nodded. You feared the Reverend would expose you, but did you kill him? Number, you are vain, Monsieur Dray, but not murderous. You may have wished him gone, but your desire was not that of a killer. No, the motive lies elsewhere. He paused. A letter was found, not written by Lott, but about him. It read, She found it. If she tells him it all ends, it must be tonight. He allowed the silence to stretch. Who is she? That much is clear. Clarissa Wire. She found evidence. Not only of theft, but of something more. He turned to Clarissa. You told me you stumbled upon the vicar's letter by accident, but it was no accident, was it? You were looking. Why? Clarissa's voice trembled. Because I saw something weeks before, a confrontation in the graveyard. Between whom? She swallowed. Mrs. Lott and Colonel Penbury. Late one evening, they were arguing. She told him it had to stop, that she wouldn't lie anymore. Gasps echoed. Mary Lott covered her mouth. Clarissa continued. Later, I saw Penbury speaking with Dray. They didn't see me. I became curious, suspicious. So I searched the church. Poirot nodded. Indeed. And that brings us to you, Mrs. Lott. Mary looked up slowly. You were once deeply in love, Poirot said gently. But not with your husband. I do not judge. The Reverend suspected it, even accepted it. But when he found the journal, he feared not only theft, but scandal. He intended to confront you, and your lover. Poirot paused. Your lover was Basil Dray. Silence fell like a curtain. Mary said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly. Poirot continued. Dray feared the Reverend would expose the affair and his embezzlement, but he did not act alone. You, Mary, had equal cause to fear disgrace. You both had motive, but only one of you had the access and opportunity to place poison in the wine. He faced Agnes Peake. Miss Peake, he said softly, you were the last to clean the communion vessels the night before the service. You always polished the chalice, did you not? Agnes looked confused. Yes. Every Saturday. But on the Sunday morning of his death, you were absent. Yes, she said. The Reverend told me to take the day. He wanted solitude for prayer. Poirot turned slowly. So then who prepared the communion that morning? Silence. Poirot's eyes settled once more on Mary Lott. You, madam. You told me you saw him writing in the study that night, and you knew he planned to take communion alone. You had access to the wine. You had reason. You had time. Mary Lott stared at Poirot for a long moment. Then, slowly, she closed her eyes. Yes, she whispered. The word fell like a stone. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt him. I only wanted to delay him, stop him from going to the bishop. I thought if he were ill, he might rethink it. But I gave too much. I miscalculated." Poirot stepped closer. "You loved another. You feared disgrace. But the Reverend never intended revenge. He was going to offer you mercy." Her voice broke. "I know, that's the worst part." Agnes sobbed quietly behind her hands. Poirot turned to Hastings. "Call Inspector Graves. The confession will need to be formalized." The storm broke outside, rain hammering the windows like applause for a grim performance. Poirot bowed his head. "The truth, mes amis," he said, "is rarely tidy, but it is always necessary." Chapter 8. Poirot's final verse. 3 days had passed since Mary Lott's quiet confession. The village of Hemswood had entered a state of suspended hush, as if unsure how to move forward after such a revelation. Rain had given way to mist. The vicarage remained closed, its curtains drawn, and Reverend Lott's funeral was scheduled for the following Sunday, an occasion that would be both solemn and silent. But Poirot was not yet finished. That Friday afternoon, he summoned all the principal figures once more to the church vestry, not Inspector Graves, nor the police, just those whose lives had intertwined around the vicar's final days. Agnes Peake arrived first, pale but composed. Clarissa followed, clutching her coat tight. Then Colonel Penbury, eyes narrowed and jaw set. Finally, Basil Dray entered, looking unusually subdued. Poirot stood beside the same prayer desk behind which the Reverend had hidden his journal. Hastings, ever loyal, stood at his right. "My friends," Poirot began, "what I share with you now is not merely a summary. It is a resolution, a final verse to the sad hymn that began with Reverend Lott's death." He clasped his hands behind his back. "We were all led to believe that Mary Lott poisoned her husband to protect her affair with Basil Dray and to prevent the exposure of his embezzlement. It was a plausible story. It was almost true." He paused. "Almost." Gasps stirred. Clarissa leaned forward. "But she confessed." But confession is not proof of guilt, especially when it comes from a place of sorrow and shame." Poirot stepped toward the center of the vestry. "There was one thing that never sat right with me." The Reverend's journal revealed that he knew who the thief was, he wrote. "I do not yet know who holds the reins." But later, he did. Yet he never wrote the name. Agnes frowned. Because he was going to speak with them? "Ah, but he did write one more thing." Poirot held up a final page from the journal. "Clarissa must go to Agnes. She knows where the rest is kept." He turned to Agnes. "And what, Miss Peake, did you reveal to me? That you knew the records were false, that you had already checked the contractor's details twice." She blinked. "Yes, but that's because—" "You were suspicious. You told no one. Why? Because you feared it would reflect poorly on the church?" He paused. "Or because you were protecting yourself?" A sharp intake of breath. Poirot continued. "The journal was hidden, yes, but someone else knew it existed. Someone who, when they saw Clarissa had found it, panicked." He produced the note again. "She found it. If she tells him, it all ends. It must be tonight." This was not written by Basil Dray, nor by Mary Lott. This was your hand, Miss Peake. "No," she gasped. Poirot stepped forward. "You were the trusted secretary. You prepared the accounts. You arranged the donations. Dray merely signed off on forged repair invoices, but you created the network. You were Stonewell Repairs. It was you who stole from the church. Slowly, methodically, under everyone's noses." Dray stood up, stunned. "I didn't know I thought the money was just redirected. She gave me documents, said they were part of a quiet project. I signed them, yes, but I didn't know." Poirot nodded gravely. "Your vanity made you a pawn. Miss Peake, however, orchestrated everything. When the vicar discovered her deception, he planned to expose it. He confided in Clarissa, whom he trusted. You realized Clarissa had found the journal. You wrote the note and planted it where I would find it, hoping to push suspicion elsewhere. Agnes had turned pale as linen. But poisoning the wine? Hastings asked. When? Poirot's voice lowered. The vicar dismissed you that Sunday morning. A surprise, yes, but one you used to your advantage. You returned briefly with your own key. You went into the vestry, pretending to retrieve gloves, but instead you dosed the wine. Clarissa whispered, but she seemed so loyal. She was loyal to her own sense of order. Her name was on every ledger, every account. The shame, the scandal, she could not bear it. Agnes stood up, trembling. I didn't mean to kill him, she said, voice raw. He was going to ruin everything. I thought, if he was sick, it would delay him, like Mary said. But I used too much. I thought I'd measured it right. Poirot gave a solemn nod. Intent is not always clear-cut, mademoiselle, but action speaks. You poisoned a man of peace. That cannot be undone. Agnes began to cry quietly into her gloves. The others watched in silence, shocked, saddened. Poirot stepped back. I will present all this to Inspector Graves, but I thought you, those who knew the Reverend best, deserved the truth in its complete form. Clarissa wiped her eyes. He always believed honesty mattered more than anything. Poirot turned to leave, then paused. One final detail, if I may, he said. The vicar's final entry, do you recall the phrase? The truth lies not in the balance sheets, but in the bonds we form. He knew what was coming, but his final thought was of people. With that, he bowed slightly and left them in silence. Outside, the mist was lifting. As he and Hastings walked slowly toward the village green, Hastings shook his head. Such a quiet woman, he muttered. You'd never guess she had it in her. Poirot gave a wistful smile. Ah, but it is always the quiet ones, mon ami, the ones who watch, who calculate. Crime, you see, is not only about passion or greed. Sometimes it is about fear. The fear of being exposed, of losing control. And you never doubted, Poirot's moustache twitched. Doubt, always, but I listen, Hastings, and more importantly, I observe. And in Miss Peake I saw not grief, but strain. Not sadness, but tension. The signs were there. They paused by the lich gate. She nearly got away with it, Hastings said. Poirot smiled softly. But nearly, my friend, is not quite. And Hercule Poirot, he deals in absolutes. He straightened his cuffs, then turned toward the road. There is still time, he said, for tea. And with that, they walked on, through the mist, into the quiet, into another waiting mystery,